Okay, hello everybody, welcome back. Hope everyone's feeling refreshed after some coffee and that little rice fruity thing, which is a bit odd but also really nice in a slightly confusing way. Speaking from personal evaluation. Okay, everyone just take a few more minutes, people can take their seats. Okay. So this is going to be a panel about interdisciplinary research. So I'm Roisin McMahon. I'm a biochemist. I'm a structural biologist at Griffith University. I'm also one of 2 deputy chairs of the EMCR Forum Executive. The other deputy chair is Hamish Clark. He's unfortunately wasn't able to join us in person, but he's watching online, so I think everyone should wave to Hamish and say hello. He's at home with his kids today, I think. So it's my absolute pleasure to have this opportunity to lead this panel discussion on interdisciplinary research. So I think it's never been a more exciting time to be an interdisciplinary researcher. But it appears, though, that it also remains a really challenging time, or still is a challenging time, to be an interdisciplinary researcher. So interdisciplinary research is touted as the means by which we're going to solve many of our biggest pressing global societal problems. Big problems like climate change, antimicrobial drug resistance, ensuring that clean water is secure, and maintaining sustainable ecosystems, feeding the world sustainably. Big, important problems. And there are active conversations happening in Australia at all levels, including at government, about how to support that sort of research here in Australia. For example, in February of this year, the Australian Research Council issued an updated statement of its explicit support for how it would facilitate interdisciplinary research. And this sits alongside reports from the Global Research Council, which is a gathering of research councils across the world, including the ARC, which made interdisciplinary research a theme for its annual meeting in 2016. However, in the same year, a study authored by Lyndall Bromham, published in Nature, using Australian Research Council data about discovery projects between 2010 and 2014, reported that during this period, that the more interdisciplinary project proposal was, the less likely that it was to be funded. And this was particularly looking at how unrelated disciplines were in a single proposal that very negatively correlated with your chances of success. So what I'd like to explore during today's panel is what really is the landscape for interdisciplinary research in Australia? What are we doing well? What could we improve? And what is the scope for us to solve these big grand challenges that I touched on at the beginning? And sort of simply, what is it like to be an interdisciplinary researcher here in Australia? So that's what we're going to explore today with my fabulous panel, who bring a wealth of experience in interdisciplinary research from university, from government, from the private sector, as well as expertise in leadership and policy and research metrics. And I think it's going to be terrific. So they are, as you can see on the slide, Brad Jackson, Anjali Jabrakesh, Trung No, Simone Maynard, and Adrian Carter. So this panel is going to run a little bit differently from the previous one. So the panelists don't have presentations or slides. Instead, I'm going to ask them to each introduce themselves briefly just from where they're seated. So a couple of minutes just to say who they are and broadly their experience and what their expertise is in. This, as Drew stressed in the last session, is so we can maximize the number of questions from all of you as you get to talk to these fabulous people. I will kick things off by leading some questions to the panel, and then we'll open to all of you. And Poll Everywhere will also be in use. So currently, there should be a Poll Everywhere question open. It's a short survey which basically asks do you do interdisciplinary research? And if so, do you work with very disparate fields or very closely related fields? We just want to get a feel for the sort of research that's happening in the room. And then that will move on to a standard open question that you can address questions to the panelists. Okay, so without further ado, I'm going to throw to my left, and maybe we'll start with Trung, who's closest to me, to introduce himself. There's a microphone just on the center of the table.
Thanks for the invitation to the panel, Carly. My interest in interdisciplinary research actually began during honours and my PhD, and I think it had a lot to do with my supervisor because he just had very eclectic interests and was able to essentially synthesise and link quite disparate concepts and observations, and so I was open to that type of thinking early on, and that sort of carried through my research, starting in visual neuroscience and now bridging into genomics, medical devices and so on. And I sort of juggled that with my another professional role doing research metrics assessments for particularly EMCRs applying for fellowships, trying to put their best foot forward, and everyone probably knows that metrics aren't everything, but they are supporting evidence for its reality now is to do metric assessments and statements for application for funding, particularly for ARC. And so I'll talk about that a bit more and happy to answer any questions.
Kia ora tātou and good morning. My name is Brad Jackson. I'm absolutely delighted to be here. This is week 8 here in Brisbane. You probably gathered I've come from Aotearoa, New Zealand. I have the honour of being the director of the Policy Innovation Hub. It's located in the South Bank campus of Griffith University. And essentially its function is it's based in the Griffith Business School, but its function is to work entirely across the university to work collaboratively with government, various levels of government, primarily state, but also local and federal and NGOs and business to tackle wicked problems, to actually combine, identify the needs and the wants, the policy issues that are emerging, and build the teams across the university to be able to deliver on that particular research. So this topic is right on. And it's certainly something that when I was considering my next move, I really relished the opportunity to engage in interdisciplinary but also applied policy research. I'm also a professor of social innovation, which is a new role, and the focus there is as a kind of link between promoting social innovation in policy responses to tackle these wicked problems. Briefly, how I got there, I started out as a geographer. Are there any geographers in the room here? Can I get a sense? The great thing about geography is basically you can hold a conversation for at least 3 minutes on pretty well every discipline in the world, but only for 3 minutes. It enabled, I got my Bachelor of Science, brackets on SOCSI, social science at the University of Bristol, and then crossed the Atlantic to do a Master of Arts. So there are very few disciplines where you can move from a science to an arts, and went from a very quantitative focus to a qualitative. I then spent about 10, 12 years in adult and continuing education in Canada. Began my PhD very much as a hobby Sunday afternoon PhD thesis for 7 years with a family, 2 kids, etc. Got that done, and that enabled me to move to New Zealand to focus on management, which is another interdisciplinary discipline. Discovered this thing called leadership, which is not a discipline, it's an interdisciplinary field. Became New Zealand's first and only professor of leadership. Thankfully, there are now 4 of us in the country, so good time to leave. Discovered, moved into, having been head of School of Management at Victoria University, moved into become head of School of Government, and that really gave me a very strong public policy and public management focus, which leads me, and I feel like I'm doing my interview all over again, to why I've taken on this role, because it's genuine, disciplinary, and it's genuinely applied. And you probably gathered I've been at this for a while, and you get to the point where you really want to make a difference in a very genuine way, and this role and that interdisciplinary focus, I think, enables me to do that. And also I'm delighted to finally, having gone from the UK to Canada to New Zealand, to finally leave the best till last and come to Australia. So I'm delighted. Great opportunity to meet and have a chance to talk with you. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. I am a robobiologist. Yes, I did term this myself. So I'm fundamentally a biologist, and now I embrace novel robotic vision technologies to solve medical challenges. So I work at the intersection of medicine, engineering, and design. And as fancy as it sounds, it's actually really hard. And I work as an early career researcher at the Australian Centre for Robotic Vision. It's an ARC Centre of Excellence, where we focus on creating robots that see better. So the idea is that when robots can see better, they can sense better, and once they sense better, we can then interact with this ever-changing world around us in a more precise manner. So I use these robotic vision technologies to solve medical challenges. I did my PhD at QUT, and I was one of the co-founders of the Medical and Healthcare Robotics team at the ARC Centre of Excellence. We spoke a lot about funding. I have not been successful in any of the ARC funding, but the Advanced Queensland fellowships have been very encouraging of the kind of work that I do that falls in the cracks of NHMRC and ARC that I think we've discussed before. The only way forward is to look at other kinds of funding and do what you're passionate about. And I feel very privileged to be here and share some of the experiences I've had. Thanks. Thank you.
Cool, thanks. My name's Adrian Carter. I'm from the Monash Institute of Cognitive and Clinical Neurosciences. I just want to thank the organisers for inviting me to come and talk about interdisciplinarity, because it's something that's quite close to my heart. I work in a sort of a new field in Australia called neuroethics, which is it's quite more developed in the US and Europe, but it's only starting to gain some traction here. And it's basically looking at some of the ethical, legal and social implications of neuroscientific advances in knowledge and technology. Most of my work has been around addiction, mental health. So looking at how neuroscientific findings might change the way that we think about people who have an addiction, their ability to control their drug use, their responsibility for their behaviour. As you can imagine, that can have a lot of important implications for the legal system, as well as the sort of clinical treatments that we might use, whether we potentially coerce people into treatment. Increasingly doing work around dementia, obesity, gambling, a whole range of areas. Also looking at the use of emerging technologies, such as technologies to intervene on the brain, so deep brain stimulation, non-invasive brain stimulation, wearable technologies, as well as diagnostic technology, so we can actually peer into the people's brains and perhaps read what they're thinking about. This raises a lot of issues around privacy of that information and the potential for these technologies to have really profound impacts on people's behaviour, potentially inducing criminal behaviours. And so the role of the group that I lead is to try and understand what are the implications for this for society, and how do we go about doing this research in a way that we can realise the potential with it while minimising some of these unexpected outcomes. My background is in neuroscience. I worked for 4 years in a wet lab, discovered I was neither good at it nor had any interest in it. So I moved in and did a PhD that was completely non-empirical in ethics, and I now run a group where we do ethical analysis, policy analysis, and we use social science methodologies. Never apologise for being a social scientist. Yeah, thanks.
Excellent, thank you very much. Sorry if I can't get the smile off my face listening to these speakers. I mean, I'm sitting near a robo-biologist and neuroscientist. It's quite amazing, actually. I'm an environmental scientist, and I did my undergrad as an ecologist, conservation biologist at Griffith University. For those who may be unsure what a conservation biologist is, I usually say David Attenborough is a conservation biologist. I was studying things like genetics of fire ants under the microscopes and seed dispersal by ants of Acacia salicina. It wasn't really for me doing the real sciencey behind a microscope. In my first life, I have a degree in hospitality management, and as soon as I got that, I took off to go travelling around Australia, and I was gone for 6 years living in a van with my dog. And so I think you can imagine that being behind a microscope didn't really suit my personality or my desires in life. So moved out of that, but much like I think it was Mel that was saying before, with some health conditions, making a few changes in your career to accommodate, and having to adapt in your life. And so no longer being able to do that line of work, I thought, well, what do I like to do? Well, I knew I liked people, and I knew I loved my country, and I knew I loved the environment I lived in. And so I went back and restudied as a mature age student to do community natural resource management, then my environmental science at Griffith Uni, and then went through to actually do my PhD at the Australian National University, but moved right out of that laboratory space. I heard about a concept that was called ecosystem services. So ecosystem services is just sort of the technical name that pinhead scientists and economists come up with to talk about the relationship that people have with the environment, all those good things that we get. Things like, fresh air and clean water and recreational opportunities and these places that are important to our mental health and our physical health, and Indigenous people having spiritual and religious connections with the environment. And so most of my work now is in the land use planning space. And when I left university and going in as a mature age student, I was very adamant that I had to come out 10 years ahead of everyone else I went to uni with, because they were 10 years younger than me. And so I took that approach. And since then, I started working with the Community Natural Resource Management body. I worked with them for 8 years, where I was working with stakeholders. Now, obviously, in ecosystem services, you can't be an expert in geology and hydrology and health and economics. So you have to work interdisciplinary with these, with your stakeholders, cross sectors and cross disciplines. So I worked there for 8 years before I went to the consulting game, and I've been working consulting now for 4 years. And I've worked in extremely diverse situations and places, from working with the Maasai in Kenya, who are seeing changes in their wetlands, and the second biggest city in Kenya actually pumping 300 kilometres away their water from Maasai lands, to working with federal governments to help them design policies and payment schemes for compensation on environmental benefits. So a whole range of things. So that's kind of me in a nutshell. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you very much. Yes, in the spirit of the conference, we have a very diverse panel with lots of diverse experiences. So a quick housekeeping notice. Sandra alerted me to the fact that the Wi-Fi dropped out, but it's back again, but you may have to reboot it, like sign back out and in again. If it's not working, just refresh it a bit, basically. But hopefully everyone should be okay now. Okay, so I thought maybe we would begin questions with a discussion really of what interdisciplinary research is. So I'm going to start with Anjali. You said in your introduction that your works maybe sounded glamorous, but actually it was just really quite hard work. You're an academic researcher, you have industry partnerships with your Advanced Queensland Fellowship, you're in an ARC Centre of Excellence, and you're a robot biologist. So what does it mean to you to be an interdisciplinary researcher? What does that look like day to day?
I think we should first start by discussing what really interdisciplinary is. It's the buzzword now that we all love to use. I don't know, I'm an early career researcher, and when I was writing my grant applications, I would look at how am I going to fit this word into all of these lines, and I'm looking at the buzzwords, put it in. I think interdisciplinary is really using people from different fields. It's an integrated approach to answer some of the questions that recognizes that you cannot work in the compartmentalized academic structure that is currently very evident. But I'd like to say that I work in a transdisciplinary group. A transdisciplinary group goes beyond bridging the divide between different disciplines. And I think the societal impact is in the center of the research in hand. On a day-to-day basis, we work on projects that kind of has a society impact. And I look at every point, we look at patient outcomes. And I work with industrial designers, engineers, roboticists, biologists, and I don't know, maybe we've had this conversation in the previous sessions where every language is different. And it's very important to understand where everybody comes from and respect each other's fields. And most often in a research environment, it's very difficult to kind of prove your contribution. That becomes really hard for future funding. You know, there's always a fight for where you want to be, what's next, what's your contribution, and how is this going to affect you continuing the research that's really important for you. But at the end of the day, it's very rewarding, and it's interesting to just understand different perspectives of working together.
Thanks. So Simone, I wonder if you could add to that, because your experience is very much working in applied research, in non-government organizations or in partnership with government. And you're now principal of your own consulting business. So what's your perspective on interdisciplinary research?
I think when I think of interdisciplinary, I think it's wonderful. Like we know that we can't be an expert in everything. You know, as somebody works, for example, in my field, as I said, I can't be a hydrologist, I can't be a geologist, I can't be an economist. And I think it's one thing to understand, however, that we need to have the conversations and connect and synthesize information and data that's extracted from these different disciplines, but also recognising that when we're working in projects, that the interdisciplinary isn't necessarily just a panacea, that these different disciplines are also held across the different sectors. So there is really a strategy to applying this. Like, you can bring an economist in and you can bring, you know, an environmental scientist in, but if you're looking at the stakeholders and what you really want to do with your research, I mean, we don't want to do research for the sake of just doing research. When you're thinking about the research you want to do, you need to think about the application of it, who you want to use that information, who are the stakeholders that you need to communicate your project with, your research with, and who do you want to use this? And so when you're thinking about the different disciplines to be involved in your project, to also be thinking about where are some of those expertise held. And sometimes part of that strategy needs to be, an economist from this sector or this department, and an earth scientist from this area and this. So thinking that cross-sectorally as well as cross-disciplines in there. And
does that present quite a unique challenge? So even if I do recognise, I need an economist from the federal government, how am I going to get one?
It is an absolute, a very difficult challenge, and a lot of the challenge just comes into the identification of who the right person is. So you might even identify the disciplines that you need in the sectors or the departments, but actually who that person is in there to approach. And just to give you a little bit of experience, you know, a lot of my work is with local governments. And perhaps for some of the areas or items that I've needed to push through in a policy sense, it may not be the most strategic move to approach the, you know, second-year environmental planner, you know, that's still feeling their way through the organisation or some of those boundaries within it, but to source out someone who's been in that game a bit longer, knows where the boundaries are. They may even be at a later stage in their career and prepared to push this, you know, and have less to lose than someone earlier in their career that's still trying to find their game. So, yeah, definitely. And I think a lot of people in their research projects don't give a lot of thought up front to, you know, they'll give it to the methods of their research, but not actually the end of your research and who's to take it up and what the end result is. What does success really mean? It can't mean a publication, surely. That's only got to be one element, if anything, a personal gratification for something greater change that you're making in the real world. So.
Thanks. I think that touches on a theme that we've seen over the last day and a half, which is about building networks and identifying the right people for the right at the right time. So Adrian, I'd like to throw a question to you now. So your research really it does span very different disciplines. You touched on neuroscience and ethics and legal and social frameworks and consideration. And so I'm kind of interested as a researcher who doesn't work in that manner, that for you to comment on sort of how you actually do that, how you manage your time and your focus, presumably working across different groups and in different ways, and the practicalities of maybe keeping all those balls up in the air. Tell us your secrets.
How I manage my time after the Think Well workshop yesterday, I badly.
But now you know how to do it, obviously.
Yeah,
and the other
that's
half
right,
of you will
that's
get
right.
let in on the secrets this afternoon.
You know, I do have to spend, especially initially when I first moved to Monash, I had to spend a great deal of time trying to identify who were the people that I needed to connect with. So I spent a lot of time thinking about what is the question that I'm trying to answer, so then identifying the disciplines and the people that I need to speak to. And then I just basically cyber-stalked people for a good few months. I'd identify people who were working in a similar area, maybe had some crossovers, and then I would just email them. And particularly if they were at Monash, I'd say, let's have a coffee, let's catch up. And generally, people are really happy to talk to you. I mean, they're flattered that you're interested in their research. And so pretty much most of the people I contacted ended up being collaborators. So, I mean, I think that's, reaching out to people is a really important part. Being visible is also really important. I think Angeline touched on this a little bit. You have to really grow your visibility. You can get a little bit lost. So people often, if you're working within disciplines, might not be aware of what it is that you're doing. Particularly for me, which is a new discipline, I'm working within a neuroscience institute. I'm trying to make the head of school or other senior executives aware of the research that I'm doing or the value of it. I've had to spend quite a lot of time just trying to grow awareness. So I think that's another big part of it. Being collegial, I think, is also important. Building relationships. So when I go and meet with potential colleagues, identifying ones who are actually interested in interdisciplinary research, I think is really important, because you can identify the people within disciplines, but not everyone is willing to work in that kind of interdisciplinary space. So there's no point investing a lot of time in those relationships when they're just not interested. And
can you get a sense of that pretty quickly?
They return your emails.
Yeah. Okay.
A natural partner for neuroethics is the philosophy department. Hopefully there's no philosophers watching. Philosophy is a discipline where people have tended to work on their own. They write solo papers, solo books, and so the notion of collaborating with people from sciences is it's a new thing, and I think there are these disciplinary barriers which still exist. Having said that, there are plenty of fantastic philosophers and ethicists that are really keen to collaborate, and so I think the key is to identifying them and then investing most of your time in those individuals, and then building trust. So if people contact you, I think there's probably some part of them is going, what do you want from me? So I often try and bring something to the conversation. So have coffee, identify mutual interest. Here's this opportunity. There's this project, or we could co-supervise a student. Here's a paper that I've been invited. Do you want to come on board? Yeah. And I think that's really important for building trust, so that people see that you're actually trying to create an ongoing collaboration. Being dependable, responsive, and reliable. I think there are other things as well. So you actually have to really invest in these relationships. But pick the ones that you think people are actually also invested in it, because they're the ones that are going to have, that are going to work in the long term.
Thanks. So continuing on from that, Anjali, so it clearly is a big investment of time, and Simone mentioned this too, that you're trying to keep abreast of lots of different disciplines at once, perhaps, or different ways of working. But that makes it all sound very negative in a sense. What are the great rewards that working in this way has brought to you? What can you do, or what would you think that this enables you to do that you just wouldn't be able to do otherwise?
Actually, it's just amazing how a thought that you take on a table and you have people from different fields, just by discussing and encouraging a good communication platform could lead to transformational solutions. And it's rewarding because you see that that sense of feeling. It's not just about writing in a grant application that you're doing transdisciplinary research, or your research could have some sort of societal impact in 40 years down the line. But I feel in the last 2 years, the 2 projects that I've kind of worked with has real potential to change the way medicine is practiced. And it's rewarding because you get that kind of acknowledgement from the industry, from the university, from the government bodies who support you and say, this is the way you should go. It is very rewarding.
That's good to hear. So on that theme of communication, speaking the same language or being able to talk to one another, I want to draw Trung into the conversation, which is about how we talk across disciplines when we come to developing reporting our track record or evaluating other people's work. And that's something I think that we can all sort of implicitly understand maybe doesn't happen very easily. So Trung, could you maybe comment a bit on, is that a big problem across disciplines, is there different assumptions or benchmarks that people have when assessing or judging other individuals' works or track record?
Yes, is a short answer. But first, I'd just like to say that I pretty much agree with everything that Adrian said. He probably hit the nail on the head with a lot of those points. And one of those was traditions in particular academic disciplines, such as citations. In humanities and social sciences, HASS, say compared to the life sciences. In HASS, you would often get single author papers that don't cite many other authors. Or say in the life sciences, you might have a collaboration of 10, 20, 300 people, and they cite a lot, and their colleagues cite them, and so you have to accept that in different disciplines there's different traditions of citation, and that is taken into account when, say in grant fellowship applications, there are standardised commercial software packages that are used. I know a lot of university libraries and university research offices use them to get an indication of an individual researcher's performance. And to take an example of a benchmark, because you have to be able to compare like with like. Like I said, to compare someone in a humanities, say who may be going for a DECRA to someone else's in the life sciences is quite different. And one of the benchmarking tools is a metric where it takes these citation practices into account, and a metric where it gives a benchmarking measure of the citations of an individual researcher compared to similar publications. And when I say similar publications, it means publications of the same year, of the same type, and of that discipline. Just to give you an example, there's one that's sort of commonly used called the field-weighted citation impact. So field-weighted, so it's relative to the field, and if you and it's commonly used in ARC funding applications. If you have a FWCI of 1, that means that you're being cited at world average, and let's say if you have a FWCI of 150, that means that you're being cited 50% more than the world average relative to similar publications. And that measure is calculated for each discipline. So for someone who's, say, a grant reviewer, they can look at an individual in one discipline and see whether this metric, how do they compare to world average across maybe other applicants who may be applying for that same fellowship but from a different discipline.
So kind of following on from that as well. So I started off by mentioning this, the paper that was published in 2016 with the ARC data, showing that, the more interdisciplinary the project was in that group of data, that the less likely it was to be successful. And the authors didn't offer any evidence as to why that was the outcome. They were just reporting it really as an observation. But what was discussed in the paper was that perhaps this was because it was they weren't being sufficiently reviewed by appropriately expert assessors, and that I think we can understand is probably quite difficult to assemble a team who can really genuinely assess a very multi or interdisciplinary project. This is really to Anjali and Adrian. Does that resonate with you? Is that your experience of maybe having papers reviewed or grant proposals reviewed? Adrian, you touched a bit on this, I suppose in a way when you're trying to justify your research even within your university. Maybe that's stemming from a lack of broad spectrum understanding or of the work that you were doing.
Yeah. I think if you're working on a project and you've got 4 or 5 disciplines represented on that project, the chances that you're going to have people within a grant review panel who have sufficient expertise to judge it is very unlikely. And I think we see this in, Anjali mentioned the ARC, NHMRC problem, and this is something that we have trouble with as well. So I work in a health and medical research area, but our research methods tend to be qualitative research. And we know that qualitative research does not get favourably reviewed at NHMRC, so you struggle to get things published. But then I can't apply to ARC for those projects because it involves health and medical. I mean, we try and play down all the health and medical aspects of the project. We're just helping society, don't care about people's health. But it's not just my area. I've got colleagues who work in computational neuroscience who struggle to get things funded through NHMRC for the same reason as they don't have the expertise on the panels to really assess the method. So I think that is one of the areas. And NHMRC and ARC are completely aware of this as an issue. Trying to find a solution.
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, they don't know. So I mean, I was at a meeting down in Canberra, and this was put to Anne Kelso, and she was basically said, yes, that is a problem, and then left it at that. So I figure if brighter minds than mine can't come up with a solution, I'm not exactly sure. Trying to have better representation on panels. Like, I think you could probably identify those fields, like computational neuroscience, maybe like your field as well, and trying to get some expert reviews around those areas that are taken into consideration, continually educating GRPs. But I think that's a struggle because there are patterns of ways of behaviour that the panels work, and they've struggled to do this with ropes and all these other initiatives that they've tried to bring into these panel assessments. So it's a really difficult problem. I think the solution is to do what you did and find alternative sources. Don't just rely on those ones.
So speaking of brighter minds, maybe Brad would like to then comment on what he could see as some of the solutions to these types of problems. So we've talked a lot about some of the challenges, and I want to introduce some discussion of solutions as well. So we talked about some problems, the peer review of grant applications or benchmarking difficulties across disciplines or communication challenges. So what do you see as some of the solutions to this, bringing your background in leadership and government and policy, maybe in overcoming some of these problems? Like, no biggie, no big question.
Yeah, well, actually, just to sort of make a fundamental point, that I think the whole focus on impact, in fact, shifting away from bibliometric impact to social and economic and environmental impact. I know that's a big policy play here and other places, and we're all scurrying to try to assess what that is. If you think about, problems are wicked problems are by definition interdisciplinary. Mm-hmm. So it doesn't take that much of a leap of thought to suggest that the solutions are interdisciplinary. Getting published, getting articles into various publications, etc., is probably less of a wicked problem, but it's a complicated problem. But it's not wicked. There are rules, there are procedures you follow, and if you do that, you will eventually succeed. So you've got a system that's geared to focusing on bibliometric as opposed to social, and therefore it's not surprising that you get disciplinary biases. I mean, that's just it's just an efficient way a bureaucracy works. But the game is changing, thankfully, and so I think just a general citizens' focus and concern about the work that we do, and wanting us to get to grapple with genuine real problems as opposed to editor-inspired problems in various journals. So I think you know, the ground is shifting, and so the fact you can focus on this ARC, I would be really interested to apply the same research to other funding, whether it's, you know, government funding or philanthropic funding, business funding, whatever. How that would pay out, because I would wager in a very broad way that in fact interdisciplinary research actually is, you know, probably more successful in those realms than in the official funded realm. So
perhaps, so
yeah,
yeah, certainly not trying to pick on the ARC. It's just the data that we have available to us. But yes, it could be better or worse in other.
But I'm saying is, I think that it would, but certainly my experience seeing applied research is that the more effective the research that tends to get the contracts has an interdisciplinary focus, because it's tackling with interdisciplinary problems. I think the broader question is that, you know, all research is interdisciplinary. It's a matter of degree. I think the other focus, and we had a conversation earlier, is about this extent to which you should be a specialist or a generalist. And certainly historically the focus has been specialise, do the same thing over and over again, and move around a little bit. But I think that it's shifting now with the focus on communication engagement. It's important to develop, you know, to bring in, you know, some more generalists. And so I think that's another distinction, and I guess the pure and applied distinction as well. I think being able to move between pure and applied, and I guess the you know, final advice that probably hasn't been picked up as much is this notion the way people generate their identities through their disciplines. As you probably gathered, that's never been the case for me. I've had a field of inquiry. I've spent 40 years pursuing it, and I've basically had to move to different disciplinary contexts to be able to tackle, you know, to get closer to that particular problem. So if you're going to identify, I wouldn't suggest you identify with a discipline. I'd say you identify with what you want to change in the world and why you want to change it. That to me is much better to focus. Yeah. It's a little trickier when it comes to promotions, when they're moving into university, etc. There are easier ways of earning a living, but in terms of satisfaction, I think that's basically what I would encourage. So yeah, a mixture of individual choices and institutional choices and government choices, I think there. But I'm actually generally optimistic with where things are going. I've been waiting this for 40 years, and I'll stick around for the next, because that's what I've seen has been really important shift and move, and I'm delighted that I'm still around for it.
Excellent. So I'm going to open the floor to questions in just 1 or 2 minutes. I'm going to ask Trung another question, but if you get ready to ask some questions, keep using the poll everywhere. So Trung, as we touched on a lot of your specialities and about the use of metrics, and maybe the systems we have at the minute are not, they are what we have, but maybe they could be improved. What do you think is the future of metrics, and what would be a better way that we could be evaluating people in the future that maybe might overcome some of these difficulties and get us out of our silos?
Yeah, that's another very good question. Thanks for that.
Yeah.
I think there's a couple of points. I think, you know, as everyone knows, bibliometrics is a scientific field of itself. You know, if you have access to data and you come up with sort of algorithms, formulas to try to get quantitative indicators of quality, which is difficult. You know, otherwise it's tedious. You have to read the papers, you know, conceptualize, think how things relate, and so that's the hard work. And so metrics is partly a bureaucratic way to assess a quality, a quantitative indicator of quality. Which it'd be great to get a E equals MC squared version of a, you know, for a grant application. That'd be great. There's a challenge. But I think metrics are here to stay. You know, they're not perfect. They're supporting evidence. And there's lots of things to include in a track record. You know, esteem measures, committee memberships, peer reviews, and so on and so forth. I've been involved doing a little bit of and touching on what sort of Brad says, that the ground is shifting, where the government sort of put in this engagement and impact assessment, which the ARC is currently running. You know, universities are providing their data to assess the engagement and impact of their work. It's complicated, but in essence, this is through sort of some information that I'm aware of, and it touches on the previous session too, is that from a pilot submission on impact, I think a couple of key points are that researchers need to engage, or from those where impact was demonstrated, was that researchers engage with diverse, relevant stakeholders from very early on. It's not the case that you just do research and then you find the stakeholder to engage with them. It's very early on. And it's not just early on, but it's sort of ongoing, deep engagement. And obviously that would require continuous funding to an extent where that engagement helps the researcher to do that work. And it involves, say, senior researchers who may be who leading a group who have these long and deep relationships with a diversity of stakeholders. Mm-hmm. And from an EMCR perspective, I think, if you, as you know, it can take 10, 15, 20 years for that impact to be sort of demonstrated in the real world. But if, say, you were part of a team that were demonstrated impact, I think it's important for you to acknowledge that and find out about it and highlight how you contributed to, say, a certain set of researchers and engagement with stakeholders during your time with the lab. And I suppose that is a difficulty for EMCRs. You have to sort of move for work. You can't be there for, say, 10 years on a particular project that carries through. So I think that's sort of important for EMCR's perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. So do we have any questions from the floor? I see a hand up immediately.
G'day, Alexa Del Bosque from Monash University. Another Monash, woo! Very interesting discussions, and it seems that a big key to interdisciplinarity is, again, the collaborations. Question, I guess, mostly for Adrian, but if anybody wants to comment. Collaborations are still there with people, and your collaborators have their own foibles and their own reputation that, especially if you're going interdisciplinary into different areas, different fields, you might not know the lay of the land. In that area, who's good to play with and who to avoid. Do you have any advice on how to avoid toxic relationships, or how to avoid, inadvertently collaborating with the one person industry won't talk to, but you didn't know any better? Any advice for that?
Trial and error. I mean, reach out to people. I think you'll soon find out who are the easy people to work with and who are the difficult people to work with. I must have been really lucky. I haven't actually had too many difficult collaborators, and if very rarely in that cases I have, that's usually the end of the collaboration, and I'll find. And so you just stick with the people who are are friendly and collegial and easy to work with. There certainly are people who I know that other people don't get on well with, and maybe that can cause some sort of issues. I guess just chatting with people and trying to be aware of any kind of issues that might create roadblocks. But I mean, researchers are people. So I find you have conversations and you find out who are nice people, who you connect with, and then work with them. But yeah, I haven't had a lot of really negative experiences. Certainly not twice.
Simone looks like she wants to say something as well. I'm not sure. I'm trying to read your smile.
I'm just going to add something to that. It's just, I don't think there's a way not to have any sort of conflict. Conflict is going to be there. And because you're just dealing with people. And the only way forward is, I think everyone needs to be trained on conflict resolution. There are proved methods on what works and what does not, no matter how difficult the person is. And I think that's a sort of training that researchers need to be successful in a interdisciplinary field. I mean, I've had a lot of people who worked in the industry who sit down and explain how certain conflict resolution models work. And I've actually tried that, and it's very effective. I don't know how many of you try, but I think if there is a course on conflict resolution, I definitely recommend it.
Yeah, there's a whole discipline on leadership. Particular, my focus is around collective leadership. That's a focus there. But one rule of thumb is that when people talk a lot about, we need to collaborate, they talk a lot about collaboration. I get nervous because if collaboration is the sort of the end as opposed to the means, and I've seen some policy interventions, some quite crude ones at the university level, where they would say you have to collaborate with at least 4 or 5 people from different disciplines for this to be, you know. In a way, it's one of those things. It's you know, if you've got a shared passion for a particular you know, problem that you want to tackle, this sort of shared purpose, and that becomes the kind of critical focus, and building something, an identity and a direction of purpose around that. I think that's critical. And then it's a sort of, oh, and I guess we're collaborating is a much better way. I do know there are professional collaborators out there that would say, let's collaborate. Who cares what the problem is? It's just we need to collaborate. And so there's a kind of an obsession around that, which I'm nervous about and I'm concerned about. Trick always, small tests. You know, Adrian was saying, just small, okay, let's try this together. But make the small test gnarly enough to actually really get a sense of who they are and what they're about, you know. And I think, you know, the final thing about leadership, and it sort of works completely counter to the way most people think about it, is if in order to influence, you must be willing to be influenced. And a lot of academics have real trouble with that, real trouble, because they've been brought up with, I must influence, I'm here to influence, that's why I'm here, I've done all this stuff, I'm not here to be, you know. So I think that's a really powerful thing to be able to say, you know, is this person willing to be influenced? And that starts with you.
So we're going to go to a question over here and then one from Paul everywhere, but first over. Yeah. Thanks, Andrew.
Hi, it's Andrew Siebel from University of Melbourne. I'm not sure I'm directing this to anyone in particular, but it's more a point on grant review panels and assessment. A lot of the fields we work in, and I say we, although I'm not directly on the front end, but in computational biology, for example, relatively new field, bringing together some pretty diverse disciplines. And when people get on grant review panels, they're targeting senior researchers with lots of experience, which is exactly what we should be doing. But a lot of these fields are only, you know, 5, 10 years old. How's a 60, 50, you know, 5-year-old person going to be an expert, you know, in assessing these grants? I mean, the NHMRC and ARC need to be targeting EMCRs to be on these panels, not just sitting in as observers, which is nice, but it's not making an impact. It's not actually bringing their expertise to the table. It's letting them observe how things work, which is great. That was a good initiative, I think. But how do we get more EMCRs onto these panels? I mean, I'd be interested to know how many people in this room have been asked to be on a grant review panel. Can I get a show of hands?
Straw poll. Yeah.
Okay, so that's nowhere near as many as it should be, right? Because there's 200 people here with great expertise across multiple disciplines, and we're not making the most of those, you know, that expertise. I mean, how do we get more EMCRs on these panels? I don't know if anyone can or wants to comment.
Oh, yeah. Anyone like to take that on?
I'm quite clearly the nearest here. I think I'm on the wrong side of 55, actually. I agree entirely. I mean, all I can say is, yes, that needs to change. And certainly, if you think about in the context of, you know, industry context, they could not afford to put all of that review power in the hands of those that have been through one particular discipline or are far removed from that. So, yeah, whatever it takes. All I'd say is, speaking from the perspective of being a head of school in 2 different schools, is, you know, bang on your head of school, bang on your doing, get in there, make a nuisance of yourself, and be proactive. I mean, if everybody in this room here had said, I will, you know, do what I can to get on these particular panels. Next year we have the same show of hands. It'll be different. So yeah, be polite and always apologise, but you know, get in there. You know, find a way to, and particularly the ones that where there are difficulties. You know, where it's going to be controversial, etc. Put your hand up and step forward, because they need to be much more diverse than they are demographically. And in other ways too. So thanks for putting that on the agenda. And there's a challenge for everybody here. So when you come back next year, let's see how we've done on that. Yeah. Okay.
Thanks.
It's an act of collective leadership.
Poll everywhere. Question from Vanessa.
We have a question from Serena from UTS. So field-based citation metrics still assume that we are siloed. What about those of us with transdisciplinary PhDs and careers? How do we show our academic worth?
I think that might be for you, Trung. Or but others are willing, of course. Welcome to contribute.
Talking about citation-based metrics to like traditional metrics, I think that it comes down to 2 points, discipline and stage of career. So as I mentioned before, if you're in HAS compared to life sciences, there are very different citation practices. And if you're an early career researcher, you may not have many publications. It hasn't been around for that long to accrue citations, whereas if you're a senior researcher, you have lots, potentially across lots of disciplines, lots of collaborators, lots of citations. And so, given that, one way to say provide supporting evidence for attention to your work, there are platforms out there like Altmetrics, where through social media you can draw attention to work you have, because that type of metric you can find that much more quickly. It can take 24 hours from when the data is updated. And peer reviews, and there are sort of platforms that you can go on to make your work more visible and discoverable. Just that point that Adrian said, I think that's very important. Has everyone heard of? I know a lot of people here on Twitter. Has everyone heard of Impact Story? Does everyone have an Impact Story profile? That's a really sort of fun and meaningful way to look at how your contribution may be your contribution to research. I mean, at UQ, we run workshops on this very thing. What type of metrics will support you in your grant and promotion applications, relative to, say, EMCRs and senior researchers. Alternative metrics such as Altmetric, Plum metrics. So there's a whole suite of things. And again, it's just supporting evidence, but you do need to provide some type of quantitative measure alongside other qualitative measures of your research contribution.
Thanks. A question at the back.
Hi, Megan Evans from the University of Queensland. I've been doing interdisciplinary research throughout my career through my PhD, essentially against the advice of many people. I've usually of a particular demographic who've said to me, you need to focus on disciplinary work until you get to professor. And generally I've ignored that advice stubbornly, and I'm still here, so that's good. But I guess my question is, I've also recently had that advice from an extremely senior member of staff at my current institution. So my question is, how do you, I guess, navigate trying to, push for interdisciplinary work and what you believe in, if, particularly if it's crossing really disparate areas like myself, social science and environment, when your current institution is still, it's still, behind in terms of thinking, and the advice is still, publish lots in one disciplines and then maybe look out the window once you get to professor.
Well, one way is to change universities, and that's what I've done. I mean, within reason. I mean, so I think it's finding those institutional contacts that are important for you to do that, and in that sense of these are the problems I want to tackle. Am I in the right milieu to do that? And I think being really quite strategic about that, and the fact that and in particular, if you, if you move into quote leadership roles, that interdisciplinarity is critical, is vital for all the things that we've talked about today. So that's, in a way, another way of leveraging is the fact that you are able. I mean, one thing I noticed about geographers, they are just represented in larger disproportionate amounts than they should be, and I think it's because of their disciplinarity in senior leadership roles. So what I'm saying is sometimes it's a combination of changing the institutions, if that's possible, or in fact moving into leadership roles where interdisciplinarity is actually valued more, because you need to be able to have your head across a whole bunch of different ways to make decisions that need to be made. So it's actually, so that would be the advice I'd give to you, but but don't move too often. I mean, stick around long enough. But I sense it's finding the right place for that particular question at that time, and what you'll learn from that, I think, is really, really vital.
I think the world around us is constantly changing, and it is very complex. So I think it's exciting. I love it. But some of the challenges that we face is also very complex, and the only way to solve them is by bringing different disciplines together. If they say you got to stick to a discipline and that's not where your passion lies, I'd say no. It's hard sometimes, but say no. I'm a great example of that, because I think I had one project that was running parallelly that no one really supported me directly. So of course I have very supporting mentors who always said, do what you're passionate about. And actually that's one of the most successful project I have, and I'm very proud about it. But I do not have a single publication, but I think it has had a great impact and a potential to change how certain things are operated.
I was given the exact same advice as well. So I'm in between neuroscience and ethics and philosophy, and I was told, you got to pick one, because if this whole neuroethics thing falls over, then you're left in this limbo land. I'd say really work on increasing your visibility and demonstrating to your heads of school and other senior executives of the value of your approach, which can be hard, particularly if you're an ECR. So find a champion, find someone like your supervisor or someone who is senior who really understands and gets what you're doing, and who will be willing to go into bat for you. And when they're meeting with the head of school, they'll go, oh yeah, this person's great. This is why this is fantastic. Look for opportunities to present your work so you can really show why it's of value. I think that's also important. And there's strength in numbers. So, you might be the only person in your school or your area who's doing exactly what you're doing, but you won't be the only person in Australia. So try and identify little networks of people who are all working the same thing, and create strength in numbers, and increase your visibility. So that'd be my advice. And yeah, definitely find a champion, someone who's a senior who will really spruik why what you're doing is important.
So Simone, we've answered this question from a university-centric perspective. Does that sort of resistance to change or inflexibility, is that as prevalent perhaps outside of the university sector? Is there anything we can learn from private industry or working with NGOs and government? What's your thought on the problem in hand?
Trying to find the right words to put this in. I find many areas and many universities quite narrow in their thinking, and it's hard to make institutional change. And within our careers, waiting for that institutional change to happen could be longer than what we need in our time frames. And for someone who works in ecosystem services, I have all been told a lot that I need to become a specialist, and it's like, well, I'm a specialist generalist, so I couldn't find myself my own niche within universities, and I never necessarily had a desire to specifically go into university, but I had a desire to do the research and the work that I wanted to do, and universities can often offer that flexibility, but I find, it is very much about specialists. It is very quite narrow in the areas that they go, and they haven't really opened their arms to the interdisciplinary field. So I just started working for myself. That was the way that I addressed the issue, was that I knew the type of work I wanted to do, and at that point I had a lot of people who were really supportive of me, didn't necessarily have the funds to give me a job or to fund my research, so I just decided to take a different angle and decided to go out and do consulting, and now I apply. Well, I've been lucky enough to not really have to apply for many at this point. It's been more people coming to me because there are areas for us, that are multidisciplinary areas. There are areas, but they just might not be in those areas, in academia. So Maybe it's just one of those questions, is academia the right place? And what draws you to academia? What is it that makes you want to work in that sector rather than the business or the industry or the consulting or some of the other areas? Maybe there's just a different place.
So I think we have a poll everywhere question from Vanessa.
Since grant review panels struggle to have the required experts, should multidisciplinary teams have to write grants that are easier to interpret for non-expert panel members? And is it the sole responsibility of the funding bodies to improve the situation?
Good question. Communication. You would like to... Yeah, thanks, Simone.
I just want to tap on that a little bit, because I would actually say that usually interdisciplinary projects are actually easier than specialists, because we are working across the disciplines, we're trying not to use the technical terms all the time. So we tend to simplify the language that we use to synthesize it and bring it together. So, for example, in my field, I'll often try and avoid the word value if I can, because an economist will use the word value different to what an environmental scientist would. And so in each of our disciplines, we all have our technical terms. So in the interdisciplinary field, I think we try and simplify it and make it easier for a broader audience to understand, where some of the other more specialist topics are highly technical and use very specialised language that, if someone doesn't have that same area of specialty, would obviously be challenged to understand.
Do we have any other? Yes, question here.
This is a question for Brad, I think, about the practical barriers to multidisciplinary work. If in general we have a declining pool of research funding, and the guidelines will be somewhere like, projects between 100,000 and 1 million, and if the more teams you add to the thing, the smaller the slices of the pie get for everybody involved, I'm sure there's lots of interest in multidisciplinary work, but when we have a practical limitation to including several collaborators, and an FTE might be $120,000 for a level B or something, you can't stick too many people together in a project to get the work done. So how do we overcome some of these practical barriers to even funding multidisciplinary work?
Yeah, I'm intrigued by this notion that interdisciplinarity means a lot more people on the team. I challenge that. I think what you want to try and do is create a team that is genuinely interdisciplinary in its approach. Everybody, not just you're from this discipline, you're from that discipline, we've ticked the boxes and away we go. I mean, it is a question of getting that requisite number. I mean, you need enough variety, but you also need a kind of core and continuity. I mean, always the issue is, what's the problem? What needs to be addressed? What's the configuration that we need to tackle that work? I get very nervous when we start saying, it's got to look like this. It's got to be, when there's so much intervention about the means, about how to do things, as opposed to, look, this is what we want you to achieve. Now go figure that out and go make the best use of this scarce public resource. I think that's a critical thing. I mean, one thing I've always been struck by is, it goes back to the comments about promotions and about, getting other research funding, because usually the rule of thumb, people sit around the table, if you've already got a lot of research money, therefore you should probably get some more. The committee, there'll be a lot of groupthink sometimes around this to say, well, look, they've already got a track record, because they're very concerned about legitimacy. What really impresses me is when I see people who have had tremendous impact, bibliometric or out in society, and they've done it on a shoestring. And I come from a country where we talk about doing things on a smell of an oily rag, and it is quite remarkable in the productivity with not doing that much, and yet we have a kind of a narrative which says it's how much money you've been able to attract, as opposed to what have you been able to achieve with that. So I get what you're saying about the declining pool. It's on us to find other pools of funding. It's also on us to be as smart as how we deploy this research, to the point of saying, no, the money's there, but that's not a good use of public resources, and being able to say no to issues. And so I get very concerned when there's such a focus on how the research should be done, as opposed to what research, and we need to be really smart, much smarter about the way we organise and work together and I see too much intervention in the way the work needs to be done, not on the outcomes.
Can I follow up on that point, which is to ask, are there other countries that are doing it really well to drive problem-based research that isn't maybe so hamstrung by the methodology of distributing the money, or is that just a naive dream?
No, well, yeah. It is amazing how isomorphic universities are. They can pretty well go, and how similar and how much they're driven by this universities are managing this way, therefore we should do it. And so you're not getting as much local variation in terms of being able to manage in distinctive ways. Look, in terms of collaboration, my experience in Scandinavia, this will be no surprise. I've worked Danish, Swedish research teams, and they get collaboration. That's sort of instilled in them from a very early age, the way they study, the way they teach. So yeah, they're better generally at blending individual as well as collective. That it's a cultural advantage. But look, great thing about Australia and New Zealand, we have an incredibly wide array of cultural resources in terms of our philosophies and our approaches to leadership, to conflict, etc. We just got to learn to capitalise on it. So, and we've got to actually get more courageous about actually saying, finding distinctive, innovative ways to get work done, as opposed to trying to determine these are the mechanistic ways that work has to get done. So I'd want to see innovation not only in research, but how research gets done. That's the exciting. And to do it for less. I mean, why not? I mean, if you can. My view has always been, I either get this money or there's a hospital bed. Is this the best use of that? It's a pretty good rule of thumb, I think, generally in a kind of crude way. Should the hospital bed be provided, or should I be doing this research? And I'm proud of the fact that I've done a lot of research on not much over the years.
Yes, Simone.
I'd just like to add to that, because I am hearing a lot about funding and monetary funding, and a real focus on funding that comes through academia areas like ARC and others. I mean, other countries like the US, for example, they have a very strong philanthropic base for their funding, very different approach to what we have in Australia. But there's lots of different ways to get funding out of there, and there's lots of different ways to get people to work and to provide you the information that you need. And it's not always about the money. I think we're all sitting in this room because we're passionate. Have you ever, sometimes, there's things that you specifically need, funding for, but there's other things that you need people's passion and their knowledge. And, to provide an example, I was the manager for the South East Queensland Ecosystem Services Project, and we were provided a $10,000 to $20,000 budget per year and told, now go away and develop an agreed framework across all the stakeholders, business, industry, local government, state government, Indigenous groups, community, an agreed framework across them all for identifying, measuring and valuing ecosystem services. And you've given me $10,000 to $20,000 to go and do this. Well, you don't throw the hat in the ring and you go, I can't do it. You find other innovative ways to do things to make this happen. And we had over 190 people involved in developing this framework, and every single one of them worked for free. So, it would have been great to have a great bucket of funds and do some beautifully spatially dynamic models to support the framework that we had, but we didn't. So we developed qualitative models, and we used these, and because so many people were involved in the project, it was their passion that said, yeah, I can put in a bit of time and work on that. And I made champions out of people. Someone was my champion on soil formation. Someone was my champion on buffering against extreme events, cyclones. These are my champions out there that were talking these and writing narratives and things for me. you know, in there, because I'm talking to them and it's like, well, if we don't have this, we can't get it done, and I can't do this. If you can't do it, who else can I ask? And then I'll ask the next person, and I'll ask the next person. And we had so many people involved in that project and so passionate about the outcome of it that I even coordinated a conference back in March, and everyone was talking about their involvement in this, and I finished that project 4 years ago. But they were being involved, and by the time the policy cycle came around, because it wasn't just about publishing, getting a publication from this, although we produced a couple of, you know, fine articles from this, it was about making the change that we needed to make in South East Queensland and get this framework and the concepts into policy. And so many people were behind it at the end that when the policy cycle came around, they were all putting in their submissions. We have to have this, we have to have ecosystem services in the statutory planning policy for South East Queensland. And so that's what actually drove it there. It wasn't the money. It wasn't because we had, you know, $5 million behind us to do this, and we probably wouldn't have got it in a policy with $5 million. We got it there because we had the support of the stakeholders in the region that all been involved in contributing it. So, as I say, I'm hearing a lot about funding here, but I'd like, you know, how many people in the room, for example, have really tried hard to get some in-kind funding. Even the forum that I ran back in March, everybody contributed to that forum something for free, from the cake maker, when we had this massive big cake on the Sustainable Development Goals. You know, there was something she threw in, a gluten-free cake, you know, to go with it. You know, everybody was throwing in something because I told them about it and they were excited and they could relate to it and they wanted to be a part of it. So please don't think that the funding is the be-all and end-all. There's a horrible old saying that there's more than one way to skin a cat.
We're going to take one question from Paul everywhere and then go back to these two on the floor. And I think that'll probably be all we have time for. Thanks, Vanessa.
Do you have any advice on managing conflict in terms of sharing money, authorship, and meeting milestones?
I think communication is the key. Make sure you communicate and, you know, share your intentions right at the beginning. I think we all learn that the hard way in most cases. But yeah, just talk about it, put your intentions down. What do you want to get out of it? What is your goal? How do you want to use the outcomes of a project or a collaboration? And I think communication is the key.
Hear, hear.
Yeah, I think also if there's a sense of there's an element of risk in terms of saying what are you willing to risk, and what are you willing to what are you, and getting some honesty around that too. I think if you can create very simple arrangements that are clearly understood. I see too many examples of very complicated contract arrangements, etc. And unless it's really clear in people's minds, it's amazing how people will start to interpret those and that becomes the main game. You create a situation where at risk you're just dependent on each other. There's no way you can get the job done otherwise. And if you create that sense of their reward can only be realised if others get rewarded too. So I think there is something around those contracts and communicate, but keep them really simple. Big rule of thumb. Do interesting things in simple structures, not the other way around. I've seen way too many examples of the other way.
So the question down here. Yeah, thanks.
Yep. Hi, I'm Damia from UNSW. I want to comment on what Simone you said. Of course, we're all here for the passion and we love what we do. But I think in institutions, it's a bit different from where you are because there is a lot of pressure on funding. Our job security depends on the funding. To be confirmed, you need to get an ARC or an NHMRC. To be promoted, you need this. So I think in that we need to be really aware it's not us. Like, I mean, we love what we do, but there is the pressure and maybe we need to question, does the institution need to change their approaches and give us the flexibility to be passionate about what we like to do. And I would like to add one more. In the ARC, there is this common thing. I'm an academic starting my career.
Saying that certainly, like, you can run a whole project just in kind, but I'm saying don't stop your project there, or don't limit your project because I only have this bucket of funds. you might only have that bucket of funds, but what else can you do around that? What can you build on with that, you know, with people's passion? And because there's one thing about what the universities want us to do, and there's another thing about actually making the change in the world that we probably all went into our professions to do, and staying true to ourselves and our own goals. And sometimes the institutions and the fundings and that we're given just isn't adequate for us to stay true to ourselves and do what we need to do. And so push past that and keep your passion and use that to drive things a little bit harder. And a majority of this does come down to communication, you know, and letting your stakeholders see what their role is and what it means to them. Because once you start having these conversations, you'll start seeing that they really want to be a part of it too. That, you know, rather than, you know, it being done, you know, separate to them, and they want to have their input into it. So, yeah, definitely it's a hard call in academia. The things that you're encouraged, you know, or from the universities to drive you to do it aren't necessarily the things that drive us as individuals to do what we do. So.
I'm just going to add to that. I agree, you just cannot live with fresh air and love and passion. But I think this is the first step towards making that change. As you said, you know, we should continue to have a conversation like this and inform people who are responsible to, you know, make the change that's required.
So one final question here, please.
Thank you. I'm convinced of the importance of interdisciplinary research. I'm Florence Cortel. I'm the founder of the Brisbane Life Science ECR Symposium, and I'll do fast advertising before I have a question. This one-day symposium aims at breaking walls between disciplines to enable young, intellectually independent minds from all around Brisbane, from all the different institutes, universities, school departments, everywhere, to meet and to explain each other, present each other their research fields and not their just current projects. Because as Anjali has said earlier on, when you're specialized, you do speak a different language than other people. So anybody that is selected, gets selected to speak at BLIS, gets to spend one day to prepare their session. Nobody actually prepares a talk. Everybody prepares their own contribution to a session that has a theme, and it's the whole audience that discusses the theme. It's never just about a very focused project. This is an annual event. Now we're searching into organizing satellite events to enable people that have met once a year to meet again and try to ignite new, groundbreaking, innovative collaborations. This has been happening in Greater Brisbane, and we are very fond of having this going on in other major Australian cities. So my question is, because today I'm facing interdisciplinary research champions, do you have some advice of things that we should be trying to organize, trying to do, to foster, nurture, ignite even better interdisciplinary research? And look at us online, blissecr.org. Thank you very much.
Yes, I went to this event held by the previous, few years ago now, the early one, Queensland Chief Scientist. And it was held at QUT, and the event was called Partner Up. What happened was there were people from all different sectors, academia, industry, and so on. And then we just got randomly put together, a team of 5, so you don't know who you got put in with. Mm-hmm. And the background to it was there were sort of very clear interdisciplinary achievements. So, for example, one example was given where they're talking about the operating theatre and how there were inefficiencies and there were increases in rates of infection and so on. And what they did was they brought in a Formula One team, right? They brought in a Formula One team to observe operating theatre because they have to be at 100, so 1,000 millisecond precision, and they were able to improve, reduce infection rates and all those type of things that they couldn't do by themselves. This is like Formula One and operating theatre. And so anyway, in this group, we got partnered up and people from different backgrounds, and we just all sort of mentioned what we did. And I was part of a group that we were successful in putting a proposal where that bridged different disciplines for some seed funding. So that's an example. I'm happy to chat with you afterwards. It forced it. Prize for collaboration. Yeah. So it forces people in that group to try to come up with an idea.
That's excellent. I think we have time for just one more quick comment from the panel. If anybody has something they'd like to contribute, I'm aware that lunch is waiting.
Well, I've been talking about collective leadership. If this group, consciously, individually, and actually said, from this there will be some distinctive things that will change in terms of the way we do work, etc. You know, I always think when you've got this kind of gathering, it's great to have people talking and conversations, but boy, if we should sort of give an hour to say, right, there's going to be 5 things that are going to come out of this that are going to be different, and there's going to be some accountability about that next year. So I'd say, you know, lunch, great way to do that. The thing that I have constantly done, and I always, I've just always put myself into situations, I always, you know, it's always about, you know, walking up to people and saying, look, I have no idea who you are, what's your gig, what are you about, and just stepping out and making that step. And not caring about which discipline, which university, who are they, what are they about. One of the things I've done historically, you know, international conferences, I constantly go to the other, you know, these big convention centers. I'm always going to other conferences, just sitting in and seeing what they're doing. I'm constantly curious. And so what I want you to do is to keep yourself saying, I got to get myself out of my comfort zone here. That's how I'm going to learn. And so really take some small risks today, but come away and saying, gosh, there's some things I've got to get done as a result of those conversations. And next year, when you come together, there'll be you know, a reporting back on those years. So seize the day. That's my University of British Columbia tour message. Seize the day. That would be my advice.
Well, I think that's
old-fashioned, but there you go, old school. But
a perfect note on which to end things. So this is actually also the point at which we're going to say farewell to our remote site participants. This will be the end of the live streaming of the event. So I want to say goodbye to them and thank our sponsors for the live streaming. So that's the University of Sydney and RI Oz, who've been our delivery partners in collaboration with the Australian Science Channel. So bye-bye, remote participants. Thank you very much for joining in.
And thanks to our chair, was it? Fantastic job. Superb chairmanship.
And please thank
well
all
done.
of our panelists with me for a really great discussion.
If anyone's lost an earring, I have it. It's a pearl earring.
Thank you very much.
Oh, cheers, thank you.